eliminate an entire people? What kind of hatred could justify gas chambers, death trains, and millions of lives extinguished? This is not an easy story, but it is a story that must be told. Today, we are going to dive into one of the darkest chapters in human history: Adolf Hitler's obsession with destroying the Jews. Where did that hatred come from? How did it spread so quickly? And why did so many follow him? But before we begin this story that will send chills down your spine, subscribe to the Talk History channel. Then leave us a comment and tell us what other dark stories you want us to investigate. Ready? Because what you're about to hear isn't taught in textbooks. How far can the hatred of a single man go? Can a twisted idea turn into state policy and drag an entire continent into the abyss? This is not just the story of it is the story of how contempt, ignorance, and indifference can become weapons deadlier than any army. During World War II, the world witnessed absolute horror. Millions of people were persecuted, imprisoned, tortured, and murdered simply for being who they were. Jews, Roma, communists, people with disabilities, homosexuals, all were marked. All were turned into targets of a machine designed to destroy them without mercy. But among all these atrocities, one question continues to haunt humanity. Why did Hitler hate the Jews? That question is not easy to answer. It was not simply a personal whim or an isolated obsession. The anti-Semitism that defined the Nazi regime had much deeper roots. To understand the genocide, we must first understand the man behind the plan and the context that fueled him. Adolf Hitler was not born hating. His childhood, though difficult, was not marked by any hostility toward Jews. He was just another child, with dreams, frustrations, and family conflicts. But something changed. Something dark began to grow inside him when the world repeatedly slammed the door in his face. And not just once, again and again. Every rejection, every failure, every humiliation piled up like embers beneath his skin. When Hitler finally found an ideology that gave meaning to his frustration, it was already too late. Hatred had become his compass. And what began as fiery speeches in crowded beer halls would eventually lead to the construction of gas chambers in camps like Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Sobibor, places where humanity reached its lowest point. But to understand how it all came to this, we have to go back. Long before the speeches, long before the war, long before the Führer, we must return to the beginning, when everything was still just resentment contained in the heart of a failed young man. And that is where our story begins. Because before the Holocaust, there was a shattered dream, a city filled with prejudice, a lost war, and an entire people who would pay the price. Before the hatred, there was a dream. And it was a surprisingly harmless one: to paint, to create, to be an artist. In his youth, Adolf Hitler was not thinking about concentration camps or world wars. He was thinking about canvases, brushes, and exhibitions. His greatest ambition was to be accepted into the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts. But Vienna had other plans. At the age of 18, Hitler left his small hometown in Austria and headed for the imperial capital with a suitcase full of hopes and drawings. But the academy did not see in him what he saw in himself. He was rejected once, and then again. He was told that his paintings lacked the talent required for academic art. They did not consider him fit, and with that, without knowing it, they threw the first spark of resentment into the world. Humiliated and directionless, Hitler began to wander through Vienna. He lived in homeless shelters, sold hand-painted postcards to survive, slept on benches and in libraries. It was a dark, lonely, and silent time. But he was not alone. Ideas began to keep him company. Dangerous ideas. He found them in newspapers, pamphlets, and cafe conversations. Nationalism, racism, conspiracy theories, all of it was there, floating in the air of an imperial city, staggering under the weight of its diversity. Vienna at that time was a cultural melting pot. Jews, Slavs, Hungarians, Germans, Czechs all shared the same space, tensions, and prejudices. The Jewish community in particular was numerous and active, with a strong presence in the arts, science, and banking. For the most conservative sectors, this was viewed with mistrust, with suspicion, with hatred. And there was Hitler, absorbing it all. It was not an immediate transformation, but little by little, his personal frustration began to find scapegoats. Scapegoats with faces, names, and a religion. Scapegoats who had nothing to do with his failure as an artist, but who conveniently became the perfect explanation. Because hating was easier than accepting that he was not good enough. One figure who marked this period was Karl Lueger, the mayor of Vienna. Charismatic, skillful, popular, and openly anti-Semitic. Lueger used hatred as an electoral strategy, and it worked. Hitler took note. Words can move the masses, and the masses can build empires or destroy civilizations. Thus, between failed drawings and hateful speeches, the young dreamer began to disappear. In his place, something else started to emerge. Something harder, darker. Because when art dies, fanaticism often takes its place, and the war had not even begun yet. Early 20th century Vienna was no ordinary city. It was the beating heart of an empire, the cultural center of Central Europe, and also a boiling cauldron of tensions. Nationalists, imperialists, liberals, anti-Semites, socialists, conservatives, all shared the same space, but not the same worldview. And among them, a failed young man was beginning to listen closely. Adolf Hitler existed in the shadows of this splendid city, without money, without prestige, without a future. But he had time, and he invested that time in observing, reading, and feeding a new identity. Not that of an artist, but that of a man who was beginning to see enemies everywhere. In Viennese cafes, where art and literature had once been discussed, people now debated theories about superior races and global conspiracies. Local publishers were filled with pamphlets accusing Jews of controlling banking, the press, and commerce. Racist ideas were not only tolerated, they were applauded. Vienna was fertile ground for ideological poison. Politics used anti-Semitism as a weapon. The press normalized it, and many citizens accepted it as common sense. For a lost young man like Hitler, this environment was not only seductive, it was revealing. He found in it a narrative for his failure. It was no longer his lack of talent. It was their fault, a simple narrative, false but effective. The speeches of Mayor Karl Lueger, a skilled populist who used hatred as an electoral tool, became a model for Hitler. Although Lueger himself had Jewish friends, his strategy was clear. Blaming a minority group for society's problems generated applause, votes, and power. Hitler also read authors like Lanz von Liebenfels, who spoke of racial purity as if it were science. Pseudo-scientific magazines mixed poorly understood Darwinism with esoteric theories. People spoke of an Aryan race destined to rule, and of inferior races that contaminated it. This is how something more than an ideology took shape. It became a worldview, one in which Hitler saw himself as the future redeemer of Germany, the man who would bring order and purity. And within that mental framework, Jews were the absolute enemy, not just one among many, the main one, the eternal one. Vienna did not turn him into a murderer, but it did educate him. It gave words to his rage. It taught him that organized hatred can be a mass tool, and it showed him that the most dangerous ideas are not born on battlefields. They are born in libraries, cafes, and speeches that no one dares to question. What Hitler absorbed in those streets did not stay there. He carried it with him. He refined it. and then he unleashed it upon the world. On June 28, 1914, a bullet fired in Sarajevo lit the fuse that would set Europe ablaze. World War I was about to begin, and a young Adolf Hitler, without money, without a career, without direction, saw in that conflict an opportunity. At last, he could serve a cause greater than himself. At last, he could belong. He enlisted as a volunteer in the German army, not the Austrian one, because despite being born in Austria, his heart already beat for Germany. He was assigned as a messenger on the Western Front, an extremely dangerous role, and although he was not a natural leader among his comrades, he carried out his duties with discipline. He was wounded, decorated, and marked forever. But it was not the gunpowder that left the deepest scar, it was the ending, because when Germany signed the armistice in 1918, Hitler could not understand it. How had they lost? At the front, soldiers were still holding their ground. It did not feel like a military defeat, so it had to be something else, a betrayal. Thus was born one of the most dangerous myths of the century, the stab in the back. A conspiracy theory claimed that Germany had not been defeated by its enemies on the battlefield, but by internal enemies, Jews, communists, traitors from within the country itself. It was an idea with no evidence, yet it resonated powerfully in a humiliated and desperate nation. The defeat was not only military, it was psychological. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, imposed brutal conditions, loss of territory, massive economic reparations, a reduced army, public humiliation. For Hitler, this was unbearable. He could not accept that his country, the one he loved with almost religious fervor, was being treated as a pariah. And so, as he had already learned in Vienna, he looked for scapegoats, and he found them once again. The Jews were, in his view, responsible for moral decay, economic bankruptcy, and social disunity, a perfect narrative for a country searching for simple explanations. The frustrated young man who had once wanted to paint landscapes now began to paint enemies, but this time not on canvas, but in the mind of an entire nation. The trauma of defeat did not create Hitler, but it gave him his cause. And his cause needed a clear enemy, one that could absorb all the hatred, all the rage, all the frustration of a devastated people. And for Hitler, that enemy had a name, a face, and a religion. As Germany struggled to rise from its ruins, a new threat was taking shape from within. It was not an army, it was an idea. And that idea already had a face, a voice, and a plan. Germany, the 1920s, a country devastated, in ruins, without pride, without direction. Inflation turned banknotes into worthless paper. Families burned German marks to keep warm. Bread lines were longer than hopes for a better future. In that chaos, the message of one man began to echo. His name was Adolf Hitler, and his message had everything a desperate people wanted to hear: external blame, promises of greatness, and a clear enemy. In 1919, he joined a small ultra-nationalist group called the German Workers' Party. No one knew him, no one took him seriously. But his ability to speak was something else. At every rally, his voice ignited the dormant passions of the crowd. His rage was contagious, his body language aggressive, his oratory hypnotic. He quickly rose within the party. He changed its name. He transformed it into the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazi Party. And with it, his worldview became political program. Hitler did not invent anti-Semitism, but he refined it, institutionalized it, and turned it into a strategy of power. In 1925, he published Mein Kampf, My Struggle, a manifesto of hatred disguised as ideology. In it, he made clear that Germany could only be saved through authoritarian leadership, the eradication of Jews, and the conquest of new territories, the infamous Lebensraum, or living space. But books were not enough. What was needed was spectacle, and Hitler understood that better than anyone. Nazism became a visual machine. Torchlit marches, red flags, striking symbols, mass anthems. Every Nazi event was a choreography of fanaticism, and the people, starving for identity, applauded. The Great Depression of 1929 was the final blow. Millions unemployed, businesses collapsing, banks failing. The Weimar Republic was dying, and Hitler promised to revive it. He promised order, he promised jobs, he promised to restore German pride. But in return, he demanded one thing: blind obedience. And a new common enemy. In 1933, he was appointed Chancellor. That same year, the parliament was set on fire, and he blamed the communists. Then he eliminated freedoms, outlawed parties, and persecuted opponents. In 1934, he proclaimed himself Führer. The state became his reflection, and in that reflection, there was no longer any place for Jews. The rise of Nazism was not an accident. It was a slow, systematic process, carefully designed to turn hatred into power, and it succeeded. Hitler did not just conquer Germany, he conquered its fears, its frustrations, and its soul. And the worst part was only beginning. When Hitler took power, hatred ceased to be rhetoric. It became law. And behind that law, a precise, meticulous industrial machine was built. A structure designed not only to isolate Jews, but to eliminate them. Systematically, without emotion, without pause. It began with signs, small prohibitions, seemingly harmless. Jews could not hold public office. Then they could not marry Germans. Then they could not enter certain businesses, or use parks, or own radios, or exist normally. Propaganda portrayed them as rats, parasites, threats to the purity of the German people. Dehumanization was the first step, and it worked. The next step was even more brutal: physical exclusion. Jews were forced to wear the Star of David on their clothing. Their businesses were looted. They were expelled from their homes and concentrated into ghettos, walled-off neighborhoods, overcrowded, without food or medicine. Life there was pure misery, and that misery was part of the plan. In 1939, when World War II broke out, the situation worsened. With the invasion of Poland, Hitler gained access to millions of Jews. And then came the final solution: a bureaucratic euphemism to conceal the unspeakable: total extermination, genocide. Beginning in 1942, 6 extermination camps were built in occupied Poland: Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Chelmno, and Majdanek. They were not labor camps. They were factories of death. Their design left no room for error. Train, selection, gas chamber, crematorium, repeat. At Auschwitz, the most infamous of them all, the process was chilling in its efficiency. Upon arrival, prisoners were separated, fit and unfit. The elderly, children, and pregnant women were sent directly to the gas chambers. The rest were condemned to forced labor until they collapsed. The sign at the entrance read, "Work sets you free." But it was a cruel lie. Work meant a slow death. 14-hour days in extreme cold, with hunger, beatings, and constant surveillance. When they were no longer useful, they were discarded. The Nazis tried to hide everything. They burned documents, demolished facilities. But they could not erase the testimonies, nor the mountains of bodies, nor the scars, nor the horror in the eyes of the few who survived. The machinery of extermination was not a moment of madness. It was a system, designed by bureaucrats, engineers, doctors, officials. It was the most terrifying demonstration of how far civilization can go when ethics disappear. And that machinery did not stop until Europe was covered in ashes. The war ended. The guns fell silent. Cities began to rebuild. But for millions of people, the horror was only beginning. Because the end of the Third Reich did not bring immediate relief, it brought a new kind of suffering, that of the survivor. The camps were liberated by Allied forces. What they found there defied all imagination. Piles of corpses, ovens still warm, skeletal prisoners who could barely speak. Men, women, and children reduced to shadows of themselves. But even after liberation, there was nowhere to return to. Many Jewish communities had been completely annihilated. Homes no longer existed. Families were gone. Hundreds of thousands of Jews ended up in refugee camps. A brutal irony, from Nazi captivity to waiting in improvised barracks, without a homeland, without certainty. Western countries offered few options. Borders remained closed. Most survivors searched for a single word: home. And for many, that home was called Palestine. But it was not that simple. The region was under British control, and restrictions on Jewish immigration were strict. Tensions with the local Arab population were rising. Even so, clandestine networks began to operate, transporting Jews to the Promised Land. In 1948, with the creation of the State of Israel, part of that diaspora finally found a place to begin again, not without conflict, not without bloodshed, but with the hope of never again being persecuted for simply existing. The Holocaust also left invisible wounds. Wounds in language, in culture, in identity. Before the war, Yiddish was spoken by more than 11 million people. It was a language full of humor, wisdom, and history. After the Holocaust, its echo was silenced, along with millions of voices. In the religious sphere, the tragedy was an earthquake. How could one continue to believe in a just God after Auschwitz? A new theology emerged, one of silence, mourning, and spiritual rebellion. Some saw it as punishment, others as the ultimate proof of divine abandonment. But no one emerged unscathed. Literature and art also searched for answers. Testimonies by Elie Wiesel, Primo Levi, and Viktor Frankl attempted to put into words what seemed impossible to narrate. Films like Schindler's List, The Pianist, and Life is Beautiful tried to recover fragments of humanity in the midst of hell. Even so, many asked, how can the unrepresentable be represented? Years later, museums, memorials, and institutions emerged. Memory became a political, educational, and ethical act, not to relive the pain, but to prevent it from happening again. Because the Holocaust did not end in 1945. It echoes every time hatred finds a new disguise, every time intolerance raises its voice. And that is why remembering is not an option, it is a duty. Never again. 2 words repeated in museums, memorials, and speeches. 2 words that have become a mantra, a promise, a warning. But is repeating them enough? The Holocaust was more than a crime. It was a moral abyss, a fracture in the history of humanity. And it did not happen in secret. It happened in plain sight, with decrees, laws, public speeches, factories, trains, and perfectly organized officials. It was not only the madness of a dictator, it was the complicity of thousands, the indifference of millions. After the war, the Nuremberg trials attempted to deliver justice. Some Nazi leaders were tried. Crimes were documented. Legal precedents were established. But that did not bring the victims back. It did not heal the souls of the survivors. And it did not prevent new genocides from repeating themselves in other corners of the world, under different names, different flags, the same logic. Because hatred does not die. It transforms. It changes shape. Sometimes it disguises itself as ideology, other times as religion, politics, or patriotism. And it always finds excuses. It always finds victims. That is why remembering is not just about telling what happened. It is about understanding how it happened and why. It is about asking how a cultured, modern, civilized society could become blind to horror. It is about recognizing the warning signs, contempt for those who are different, disinformation, fanaticism, the normalization of hatred. Every time we forget, we open the door for history to repeat itself. Perhaps with different protagonists, different victims, but with the same darkness. That is why the Holocaust is not just a chapter of the past. It is a mirror, one that forces us to look at ourselves and to decide whether we are part of the silence or part of the memory. Never again must not be a phrase. It must be a commitment, alive, uncomfortable, urgent. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. If you enjoyed this video and are passionate about this kind of content, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss